Most schools try to improve teaching the wrong way.
Top-down professional development, doing a one-off, that is definitely the number one killer of professional learning.
Take us to a moment when you realized that good professional learning doesn't automatically scale.
We see too often as not that you said that it's really just a sit and get, and
What's the difference between forcing adoption and building momentum?
you go slow to go fast.
Dr. Rhoads is an edtech and instructional leader focused on AI integration, inclusive teaching, and empowering educators to improve student learning across TK-20 education.
Some leaders say they don't have time for coaching cycles.
Are you an instructional leader or are you a manager?
If I was a new leader stepping into the role and you had me for 5 minutes, could you break it down for me what this actually looks like?
I see a lot of people just trying to survive, but also that silver bullet that's going to change everyone's fortunes.
Most schools try to improve teaching the wrong way. They run professional development for everyone at the same time, and it almost never scales. Dr. Matt Rhoads, you spent years studying how coaching and professional learning actually spread through organizations. So let me start here. What's the fastest way a school leader can accidentally kill instructional improvement, even when they're trying to help teachers?
Just top-down professional development, doing a one-off, sit and get, and that's it. And don't do any follow-up after that. That is definitely the number one killer of professional learning. And really, it takes uh, instructional coaching, and then doing it strategically to really scale that capacity of teachers over time. So that's kind of really, and a lot of the research really points to instructional coaching. Uh, Black in 2018 with his authors essentially said that it was like a 50 study meta-analysis where it showed a 0.59 deviation of like how that meta-analysis impacting student achievement. And really instructional coaching, if we're looking at all professional development, is probably one of the largest accelerators of it versus really any other form of professional development that's out there. So it's really a powerful tool. And when you look at it in a lot of different organizations, we see too often as not that you said that it's really just a sit and get, and it's a killer. And ultimately, I think really the solution is scaling instructional coaching, but also I think a lot of leaders nowadays need to be that instructional coach, and a lot of principals out there, unfortunately, have been moved more towards you're just managing and surviving versus actually being that instructional leader. And a lot of times it's not the fault of themselves; it's a system. But really, whether it's the instructional leader, the principal doing the coaching and slash or having instructional coaches there is really what drives that growth.
Take us to a moment when you realized that good professional learning doesn't automatically scale. What was happening?
So it looks like when you're at a school and you have a number of sit-in gets throughout the year, and ultimately it's a couple of initiatives or instructional practices, and then once you leave that professional development, it stays in that professional development. So that's when early on in my career I realized that that's really not going to be the type of learning that's going to stick. It's really that classroom application where teachers essentially rehearse that particular strategy or using technology in the classroom, and then ultimately then having someone observe them, but also during coaching opportunities is that they will essentially have the teacher practice in front of them and show them how to do that particular strategy, provide that feedback even before they go to students. And ultimately, focusing on a small department first of teachers is often the best piece of advice to start, because ultimately you're going to need to start building enthusiasts within your organization to really want to propel that instructional growth, especially if it's something new that you want to start. And then once you build those enthusiasts and you build that capacity within those, like using the train model, or for example, having department leads, then then coaching others within their department. You really want to focus on those enthusiasts first, and then over time, then focus on then diffusing it within your school. And that can take time depending on the resources that you have. But that's really one of the big facets of really improving um, capacity over time. But also, too, it's really focusing on that one or two things that really going to be focusing that coaching on throughout the entire school year versus having too many initiatives that or practices that you want to integrate in the classroom.
Dr. Rhodes, what assumption were you making about how learning spreads in schools when you first started your work?
Well, I think that I didn't really have a lot of knowledge about organizational diffusion, and it wasn't until probably 2019 when I started reading a lot of Everett Rogers' work. And he's not even from education, but he's focused on organizational diffusion of different like things that people need to learn to propel the organization forward. And really, a lot of his research relates to when you're looking at innovation or new practices with an organization, really in order to diffuse them throughout, the goals to get around that 70 to 80% range so that the organization can propel forward with those. This is that, um, it takes um, really a strategic effort for learning to take place. It just can't be just a one-off type thing or a couple things here and there. It's got to be really strategic. And as a leader, you have to figure out what structures in place are going to allow you to diffuse that within your school. What do you have access to? Do you have access to professional learning communities? Do you have access to, um, you know, 6 times a year, you're going to do a full length professional development, but then after, you're going to have follow up coaching and activities for teachers to put that in practice. So it's really that systems based, systems thinking piece that goes into that organizational diffusion piece. And it wasn't really until that 2019 year where I really started to understand how that came together.
So, Dr. Rhodes, later, I want you to teach us how leaders actually scale coaching across a system because a lot of schools have good ideas that never move beyond a handful of classrooms. Alchemists, today we're joined by Dr. Matthew Rhodes, an ed tech and instructional leader specializing in instructional coaching, AI and technology integration, co teaching and inclusion strategies, and data driven leadership. His work focuses on empowering educators and scaling learning across schools and districts. So great teaching practices don't stay isolated. This episode solves a real leadership problem for us today. How do you scale coaching and professional learning across an organization without overwhelming people or losing quality? Dr. Rhodes, thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to join me on the Elemental Educator podcast. It is my pleasure to have you here tonight.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I love talking about these types of things and enjoy talking with other educators like yourself that are leaders and learning from each other.
And with that, let's jump into our first segment. Let's get into that earth element and grounded moments.
3, 2, 1.
Dr. Matt, we'll start with a game here to surface how you lead. I'll read a statement and you just have to tell me principle or preference. And we might unpack a few after that, but there's no time for explanation during the game. Make sense?
Sure, sounds good.
All right. So, principle or preference, instructional coaching changes teaching more than traditional professional development.
Principle,
Scaling improvement requires systems, not just great presentations.
principle,
Data should guide leadership decisions more than intuition.
principle, but with a caveat.
Innovation spreads through relationships, not announcements.
Principle,
Professional learning fails when leaders try to reach everyone at once.
principle,
Coaching cycles create deeper change than one off workshops.
principle,
Instructional leaders should design systems, not just deliver training.
principle,
AI should assist decision making in education.
principle for those very systems.
Teachers learn best when learning is embedded in daily practice.
Principle,
And sustainable improvement requires internal capacity building.
principle,
Okay, I got to make these harder because this is the second interview in a row where it's been principal the whole way through. But we did have a caveat, and I'd like to know why and what is our caveat here.
Yeah. So when we look at um, coaching itself, I think that there's a lot of perceptions of and research of how it can be done. And I think when it comes down to it, it really comes down to each individual leader and their various types of personas and traits to make it more impactful. And it just really depends on what's your style? Are you more of an authoritative coach? Are you more of like the relationship type coach? And it also applies to like, for example, like distributive leadership. Are you more of a transformative leadership? That kind of also boils down into your coaching and the systems that you develop. So that's why I said caveat, because there's a lot that can go into this that it's a little differentiated in that approach. We haven't figured out like what's the best thus far.
So, if a school leader adopted only one of those principles that we've talked about from above here, which would accelerate instructional improvement the fastest?
I would just say from my experience is that I think you want to keep it simple. That's why I always recommend if you're just first starting this type of work, focusing on Jim Knight's framework, the impact cycle, makes it very simple. It's data driven and it's really only 3 steps where you kind of set your goal, set kind of where you're going to go, what data you're going to collect with that goal, whether that's, observations, assessment data, etc. And then you work on that goal and implement that goal and then you come back to the drawing board again and then set that goal again. So it's really, really simple and can have a large impact because you're focusing on really one thing or two things at a time, and that's it. And you're just growing through those short-term goals that you're developing over the course of that 3-step cycle. So that's kind of where I always recommend people to start in terms of you want it like a structure of setting up coaching. But when it comes to that approach piece, like in terms of how that coaching happens during that impact cycle, there's a lot of differentiation of like how you can act, right? So I always like to have, you build that relationship and rapport with them. But also too, it depends on your role. If you're an instructional coach, you're more at the similar level of the teacher versus being a school leader and administrator where you're focusing on not only coaching, but you're focused on that evaluation piece. So it depends on where you are on that totem pole of your position in leadership in a school. Um, but I tend to, depending on you know, what position I'm in, I like to first build that relationship piece, getting to really know the person, but also getting to know kind of like why they believe certain things in the classroom, like their
Uh-huh.
dispositions related to their practices, because I like to, listen to them and ask certain questions about how they think learning happens, and then looking at how does their routines look in the classroom? What type of instructional strategies are they delivering during like formative assessment? Are they using mini whiteboards do they use guided notes or do they use station rotation during independent practice or do they have always a digital exit ticket where they're collecting data? So I always like listening and asking those types of questions, but also understanding how does learning take place? Because a lot of people, I think, really don't understand how it takes place because that's a change in your memory and understanding how working memory works and how that can be encoded to long-term memory. So understanding that and cognitive load. So I always like to, get to know them, ask a lot of questions because then that really helps me then figure out what do they know, what do they don't know, and then what ultimately like buttons can I press because I'll have an idea of what their dispositions are and then that really can help me accelerate kind of where we want to go with our goals.
Thank you for the detailed answer there. I feel like I can start to picture at least your process a little bit. My only thought to that is, if you're in a school that's overseeing 50 to 100, couple hundred of staff, how are you making sure you have time to action what you're saying?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that it just depends. So if you at a 3,000 student high school, for example, and you're a principal and you have a bunch of assistant principals, how I would do it as a principal, I would focus a lot of this assistant principals on various departments where they're going to
Uh-huh.
focus on a couple teachers here and there for that coaching piece that's outside of their normal evaluation piece. So you're going to do that versus Or, for example, if I have a couple instructional coaches on staff, then I'm going to go and have them focus on essentially 2 departments that year, on a couple teachers here and there for their longer coaching cycles where we really need to, improve our test scores, for example, in math in the third, at the, ninth grade level, um, depending on what your what your state testing looks like. Um, but you distribute people to focus on a few staff members within departments to help then essentially then scale it, because you can't do it with everyone that in one year. You're going to have to be strategic and hit maybe 15 to 20% of your staff that year. That's
Mhm.
outside the current evaluation cycle because it's just unrealistic in terms of time. And also relates to how many resources you have. I mean, it could be more or less depending on how many, school administrators you have, instructional coaches. You could also use teacher leaders as well. I've seen that model as well. But you also then with a teacher leader, they only have so much time as well, and resources they have and resources that you can provide them for, going to a couple classrooms a week to do a coaching cycle with a teacher. So those factors need to come into play, and those are when you think about the systems you need to develop, or that resource management piece. But then, how am I going to allocate uh, these individuals? But if I was just one person coaching 100 teachers, I'm going to focus on my coaching on maybe like 5 to 15 teachers max. But I'm also going to go on learning walks every week to get into every classroom I can to see trends around the building. So then I can
That's right.
essentially see
Yeah.
kind of what's happening in at the school, so then I can use that to calibrate with other leaders and seeing what they're seeing, and then look at what they're doing for their coaching so that we can have alignment piece. So that's kind of how I would strategize, but it depends, what your circumstances.
That's right. The importance of sharing the load in those larger settings to scale, right? That you're talking about here.
Yep.
It's crucial for success in teams. Before we go deeper to your values and what you stand on, we're going to play our second game already. And so what I want you to do here, Dr. Matt, is I want you to think of the very first job that you ever held. You might have been a teenager, you might have been before a teenager, whatever that time is, your very first job. Do you got it in mind?
I do, yeah. So I was.
Don't tell me.
Okay, I won't tell you.
Here we go. I'm going to take 2 minutes and I'm going to try to guess your very first job. Okay. Oh, I almost got it on the first try there because you told me. But okay, here we go. I'm gonna try my best to get it. Here we go. Okay, Dr. Matt, was it a seasonal job?
No,
No. Okay. Did you have to wear a uniform when you were doing this job?
the only uniform I had was I had to put gloves on my hands.
You had to put gloves on your hands. Okay. Was it for a business or something family run?
It was a business. It was a family business.
Okay, family business. There we go. And you had to put gloves on your hands. Were you offering like a labor-intensive service for other people?
Yes.
Yeah.
We
Okay.
were preparing it once a week.
Once a week. Okay. Inside or outside?
It was inside, but they were distributed outside.
Inside, distributed outside. Was it like a cleaning service?
No, it wasn't a cleaning service.
Okay, inside but distributed outside. So would you travel to people's houses to deliver this service, or would they come to you?
Well, we were part of the process before they were distributed to everyone's house.
Before, so you were part of a packaging team before you sent something. So did you guys like invent a product that you were then shipping out to people?
It wasn't a product. It was more about like information.
It's information. Okay, so it was related to like mail services then?
It is related to mail, but
Okay,
it's not mail.
but it's not mail. But it is. Did you use the mail service?
Well, we did use the local mail service, yes, but we also
Okay.
distributed the family business itself, like distributed it as well.
Okay, so were you like handing out flyers or brochures for people?
They're similar to that,
Similar
but
to that? It was
I'll give you a clue. Generally, maybe like 10, 15 years ago, everyone's getting them every day.
newspaper.
It was a newspaper, but it was
You
a
were.
newsletter.
It was what? Sorry.
It was a newsletter.
It
It
was a
was a
newsletter.
free
Okay,
newsletter.
there's my time. That's 2 minutes. So you distributed a newsletter for a family-run business?
Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna have to leave it to the people listening to determine if I got that or not, in the right amount of time. We were super close. Super funny though, my last person I played this game with, it was newspaper roots as well, so we were right on par with that. I was almost up the alley. What I wanna know, Dr. Rhodes, is what did this first job of distributing a newsletter for for your family business, uh, help set you up with for success in your studies now within leadership?
Oh, I mean, I just think, well, we were actually the ones that were folding them. So we took them off the line and we took and folded the papers and made it so that they could be, um, you know, packaged and distributed. So what we
Okay,
did is we had a assembly line of 3 or 4 of us, and each of us had a job, and we were able to, when we had to get through, thousands of these in one night before they would go out. So it was a matter of who was there, because sometimes there's alternative people that showed up. And then my sister also joined us, and we, it took like 5 to 6 hours to do, and it was that repetition. But you had to teach someone if they came in how to do some of the skills, because a lot of times, you had 1 or 2 people that were new each time. So you had to model and show them what to do for that particular step of that assembly line, right? So in order for them to be successful, and I think that relates to a lot in leadership, because within organizations, if you have people leave the organization and come in all the time, right?
mhm,
And I think you really got to set up systems like, for example, if someone leaves, they need to understand what they're coming into and have resources and training of what they need to do. Um, from that one person that had left. And a lot of organizations that I've been a part of is they don't provide a really good sense of that in training, and that person is lost. So I think that really schools that have really good onboarding and then coaching for new teachers, when they start with them, is really an effective way for retention, as well as making them successful for their students. So I think, like, that's what I learned in that job is that you're only as strong as your weakest links. And if you don't coach
that's
them
right.
up, then, it's going to really impact your your effectiveness as an organization to get that task done. So I think that is what I can take away from that experience.
And you touch on, the terminology of like instructional leadership and getting in the trenches with the people around you and modeling that through, the labor intensive of folding up the newsletters to make sure they got out there. Where I teach, it's every administrator also has a teaching load as well, and to get in the trenches and have a chance to model it with people and see what is the struggle people are going through when we have those communications. It's super important to also just create that understanding between staff. So when you have somebody new coming on, you can say, okay, this is what it's going to feel like for them. Maybe not the full extent, but here's what I know that I can start to help with. Dr. Dr. Matt, before coming on the show, you shared the quote, you can't bring everyone into the water, but you can certainly bring along many. What does that mean to you as a leader trying to scale learning across an organization?
I think it just goes back to Everett Rogers, is that you can bring everyone in, but it doesn't mean that they're going to be able to soak everything in. So you got to figure out ways for them to soak it in, right? You have to create systems where they're going to actually drink the Kool-Aid. If if I can, give you an expression, is that you got to
Mhm.
essentially create those systems for them to soak it up and learn what the organization does and how to be effective within your school. So that's what I meant by that quote, is that not everyone's going to be able to do it, and really you need to get to that 80% range for you guys to be really impactful as a school. 80% teachers at least on board, and and learning over the course of time that they're with you for it to, progress forward. And as a coach and instructional leader, um, you're going to focus first on people that really want to be there and they're drinking it, um, and soaking up the water, so that they can then percolate to others in the organization so that they
What
can learn it as well.
with that, what's the difference between forcing adoption and building momentum?
Forcing adoption is, I think, when you try to do it all at once. I think adoption should be something that is, it's definitely you go slow to go fast. And I think that a lot of schools and districts try to adopt things like immediately, like it's black and white. But in reality, it's a more gray area that you need to have steps over time to adopt. You adopt for one or two teams, then three and four teams, and then five and six teams that you really adopt versus doing everything all at once. Because you won't gain as much um, resentment within the school, but also you can see how the adoption goes with certain teams at
Mhm.
a pace where you can actually make adjustments. Versus if you do everyone else at one time, you have your eggs in one basket, and it could go, could go either positively or really negatively. You really can't adjust the plane at that point. You got to keep flying, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and as we are in that plane, we start to face those adverse moments that come forward that we have to try to then build that plane as we're flying is another term that we often hear. Let's use that to jump into our next segment, our air element. And so let's get into headwinds and tailwinds. All right, Dr. Matt, I am going to put you on the hot seat. I've got 5 scenarios. I'll read you the sentence, and then in 10 seconds or less, I just want your first move on how we should be handling the situation, okay?
Sounds good.
Teachers say they're overwhelmed with initiatives.
So I would first start asking questions about what do they think the initiatives are so that you can see if they're actually the initiatives that you're actually wanting to move forward versus things that you could possibly take off their plate.
Professional learning happens, but classroom practice isn't changing.
Then I would look and see if that's happening just in that one classroom or across many classrooms, because then that would make me have to either evaluate whether we're doing something wrong in terms of professional learning or something else is in the air.
Yeah, I like that answer. Good answer. Instructional coaching works with a few teachers, but isn't spreading.
And we'll first work with a few teachers, but you then have to have patience to make it percolate into your organization. Really, it's a time intensive uh, labor. It's not something that happens overnight. If we're looking for um, a quick fix, instructional coaching is not your silver bullet.
A new initiative launches, but engagement is uneven.
I would look and see kind of what we're doing with that initiative and how we launched it. Did we launch it just with one newsletter? Was it an email? Did we have a Ignite professional learning session where it's followed by, hey, we're going to be doing this in our PLCs now for the next 6 months? I would look at it at that angle because then I can then start seeing there's a cause and effect here, or there's
Mhm.
something that maybe we need to take into account for. Maybe um, for this couple departments, it's been a really tough group of kids this last couple years, and it's something that we have really had not much answer for, and they are trying their best just to survive.
And you realize you're trying to push change faster than the system can absorb.
Change takes time, and also I think what's great about your question is that absorption piece. What's actually happening in classrooms? What are teachers actually doing? And what is actually our focus direction? If it is part of our focus direction, that's great. But if it's not, let's erase those things. Let's get rid of those things.
Dr. Matt, in your work with schools, divisions, leaders, which of those that we just talked about is the most prevalent that you see?
I see a lot of people just trying to survive, but also that silver bullet that's gonna change everyone's fortunes. I think that really we have to build systems that take time for them to then sprout. I always liken it to the analogy of You're planting a field of flowers. It's going to take a long time for them to start growing buds, and then it's going to take even more time for certain ones to grow and flower versus others. I think if you have to look at it like that, and you have to tend to it over time, because maybe that first crop is not going to be as good as the second and third crop. So I
Mhm.
think keeping that analogy in mind is that, and again, we have to go slow to then go fast.
Right. Speaking of that silver bullet, early in their leadership journeys, many school leaders assume that the professional learning, if it's good enough, everyone will implement it. Why does that assumption take hold so easily?
I think a lot of school leaders go into it thinking that, especially if they're coming from the classroom, knowing that it's a different form of like control that you have in the classroom versus the school. It's a whole different type of animal that you're trying to navigate. It's different, essentially, personalities when you're working with adults versus kids. I think that you have to learn entirely new systems of how you're just navigating, just managing the school, but also how am I on top of that going to drive the instruction moving forward? Because a lot of people don't have that experience when you're first starting as a school leader. A lot of people don't come up as an instructional coach or even coming from a district office position where they are actually coaching teachers to when they are, if they move up from a teacher to maybe a department head to then a school leader, maybe they've had limited experience. So I
Mhm.
think that there's a lot to be said about, building that experience to be that instructional leader, because I think coming into being assistant principal a lot of times, and then even the principalship, there's a lot of limited experience that's happening. And I think nowadays where we look at school leaders that are starting to run schools in the time that we're in, it's a short bench versus what it was historically.
Yeah, that's a very good observation, and I would say that that's pretty ubiquitous to the world where we're seeing fewer longer stints in
Exactly.
school leadership.
I
What would
hardly
you
see
s
anyone. I hardly see anyone past 5 years these days.
Mhm,
I think most principals are 3 years max, maybe 5, depending on the how large the school is. I do see once in a while smaller schools, have principals for much longer. That's kind of the big variable what I see.
mhm, and one of the things that I've seen that's been successful is rotating principals, and so just ensuring that if you're within a division, you're actually not going to be in the same setting longer than 5 years, and then you're going to get moved somewhere else. That idea of a fresh start, you get to let go of everything that you maybe took personally in those 5 years that built up, while you were in charge. Dr. Rhodes, what would you say to leaders who interpret slow adoption as resistance?
I would say that what are people actually doing? And then say that first, like observe that first. What are people actually doing versus what are they saying? Because you can have a lot of noise in the room about, hey, I don't like this or I don't want to do this. But let's see what people are doing in terms of their actions before we go ahead and make that judgment. Because I think that a lot of people want to blame and not allow it to actually cultivate over time. So I really think that we got to focus on that strategy first before we
Mhm.
come to any sort of conclusions of what's happening.
And let's get into our second game of the air element here. This is called Flip the Script. So I'm going to share with you something that I've looked up that was a question somebody would have asked at some point on answerthepublic.com related to education, related to leaders. And I just want, they're all pretty negative. And so what I want you to do is flip what they're saying into something positive here, okay? If the professional development was good, everyone should implement it.
Generally, when a professional development's good, it means that maybe some are implementing it, not all, because I think it's unrealistic to think that everyone's going to follow along after one professional development session.
Teachers who don't adopt new practices are resistant. Why?
Not always. Sometimes they're the best experts in the room, and sometimes we don't listen to them.
If we train everyone, change will happen.
We can always train people, but doesn't mean it's going to result in execution.
If we push hard enough, improvement will spread.
Effort doesn't always translate to improvement.
And technology automatically improves instruction.
That's completely false. There's a lot of research that says technology does not improve instruction.
Dr. Matt, what belief did you personally have to dismantle to become a better leader?
Something that I work with every day is that you just can't take everything personally. You just can't take things personally. It's not always um, people complaining about you. It's about the system itself or experiences that you have no control over. So I think that is something that we and a lot of leaders and I tend to continue to work through.
What is something that we tend to take personally that we shouldn't?
I think when someone says that something doesn't work well or we're a little bit overwhelmed, there's too much happening. I think that sometimes you have to think to yourself and try to put yourself in their shoes, um, to try to think about why are they saying what they're saying, and then as a result, a lot of times it's not actually against who you are and what you believe. It's just
Mhm.
versus just what's happening in the now.
One of the hardest things that I always took personally was if I had an idea or somebody had an idea and I said, I'm going to try to action and run with this. And then all of a sudden it didn't land, it flopped. We needed to pivot or go a different direction. I took that personally all the time. And it took a while to realize that they're still trying to work within the same team to make the best decisions possible and to view them as a part of that process. And whatever decision I chose to put forward, I needed to look at as a living decision that could be changed, revisited, and altered as
Yeah.
well. And once I came to that understanding, I stopped taking things so personally and I started to actually just think about everything is almost an experiment in its own. Every time we decide to do something, right? We're researching how well is it landing and what's the next step guided from the information we were able to collect. So speaking of those implementations, let's move on from the adversity we're facing to the change that we want to action. And so let's get into the water element and ripples of change. All right, Dr. Matt, we are going to get into quick tips to kick off our water element segment here. And so I'm just going to read out, a question for you. And I just want your quickest piece of advice for it, just short answer and a practical takeaway. So let's start with one practice that helps instructional coaching scale across schools.
Really, it's about focusing on maybe about 15 to 20% of the teachers on that are really first enthusiasts that you can get that support with, because once you have that support, you can then focus on the what we call the mid majority, which is about 30, the next 30%. And
Mhm.
if you have 20% that are already starting to do it and starting to do it really well, they can help you then start coaching the other 30%. And if you can get that up to 50%, then we can really get those additional 15 to 25% of the rest of the staff. You'll never and you'll never get that last 20 to 10%. That's just unrealistic. But you can get that if you can get that first 50% after the first 6 months to a year and a half, then you're in pretty good shape, and you should
Mhm.
be feeling pretty good about how you scaled it, because you want to focus on people that will really be the ones that uh, can really practice it, get better at it, and then teach others besides what you're doing in the coaching.
So speaking of that first 20%, one way to move from professional development to real classroom change.
Yeah. So just one example that I like to do is we always start off with this like Ignite session. The Ignite session is me modeling how to do particular strategies or integrations. And then what we do is then a number of teachers are selected to where then we go into the classroom, and before they go, we actually plan a lesson with them, and actually they rehearse what they're going to do with us. And ultimately, what will happen is that we'll kind of give them some initial feedback in terms of planning and what that strategy is going to look like because they've rehearsed it. And then we'll come back in and provide that observation and feedback. And then what we'll do then is to then have a second professional development session, which is like the halfway point where we then learn from what essentially we've done over the last, so odd period of time and maybe reteach a number of things, but also maybe add a couple things into the equation. And then also let teachers that have been a part of it provide their own feedback as well as like what's went well versus what
Mhm.
the challenge has been. Then we can monitor and adjust. Then essentially the same cycle starts between the second um, professional development that I'm talking about. The coaching goes in between that. And then the third one, which is the third part of the series. And then we generally do it 2 to 3 series a year that are focused on a variety of different instructional strategies. Usually they're grounded in like 2 or 3, and sometimes it's a technology or AI tool. So we try to keep those themes within those frameworks so that the coaching percolates from them. And then we can essentially monitor and adjust as we go based on what we're seeing in the coaching as well as the classrooms.
Keeping with that 20%, one way leaders can identify those innovators and early adapters.
I think that if you get around a lot to certain classrooms, you can see people that are really engaged in their work. And sometimes they may not be the most passionate people, but if you have some conversations with them about their instruction and what's happening in their classroom, you can find things about them that really kind of raise their eyebrows or really kind of gauge their antenna. And then that allows you to kind of know whether this person is going to be someone that you want to maybe like bring along for this part of the journey.
What is the most important data signal that will tell a leader that their change is actually happening?
So I always encourage coaches and the coaching myself is take a lot of log your data, log the number of hours, and we do various types of coaching tags based on what we do. And what we'll do is over the course of like a quarter, semester, year, we'll either do a couple of calculations based on formative assessment scores over time or that summative assessment scores. And then we'll go ahead and see through whether usually we have 3 or 4 different variables that we're looking for or that we're tagging. We'll run that through what we call multilinear regression. And we'll see if there's actually a relationship with the coaching as well as that summative data so that we can see like, okay, maybe these are variables that we can see maybe are possibly making a difference versus what we visually see.
Mhm.
Because we're also taking notes about what we visually see in the classroom. So we'll take that data that we've done that analysis on, and then we'll take the visual data that we've seen and we'll triangulate it and see, are we seeing these practices happening? And then are these practices actually from what we're doing with our coaching and the time that's invested based on these practices? Is there possibly a relationship with us making a difference in student scores?
Dr. Matt, you've worked so much on scaling instructional coaching across systems, and we've broken it down a little bit here. If I was a new leader stepping into the role and you had me for 5 minutes, could you break it down for me what this actually looks like when it works?
Yeah, I always like to talk about this because I think there's 5 big themes that now instructional coaching and leadership comes down into. Um, and this is based on my book, 25 Tips for Instructional Coaches and Leaders, is what is relationships, building relationships with others, and essentially kind of listening and learning what's happening in your school. The second is really understanding like what evidence-based practices are, how learning happens. Understanding those is really key. Then looking at um, instructional coaching practices of like how can you assess yourself and look at various instructional coaching practices that will work for you as well as your school. 4 is technology and AI. How can you utilize those to help your instructional coaching program as well as you to be more efficient and effective without spending too much time dragged down in administrative tasks? And then 5, which is I think also extremely critical, is understanding systems. How do you develop systems, but understanding the systems during your school? What union restrictions do you have? What does a bell schedule look like? What does the master schedule look like? How can we integrate time for instructional leadership and coaching within my own daily calendar? Those 5
Mhm.
themes for me come to light because they are critical for you to really move forward as an instructional coach and leader.
So if we were, like I said, had 5 minutes and you did this in four, and I had a minute left, and my follow up question to you was, okay, but how does learning happen? What would you say?
I would say learning happens is when students essentially or adults remember what they've learned over time, and do we see it over time? Is it durable? Is the learning actually durable? If it's only a day or a week, then ultimately it's not that durable. But if it's over time, like number of months or 6 months later or a year later, then that means that they've learned it. And there's a lot
Mhm.
of different strategies to help learning happen, modeling, examples, um, testing, formative assessment. Um, there's a lot. And then also, I think, spacing your learning, but also what we call interleaving old and new concepts that you're reviewing that's also integrated with the new concepts so that you're reviewing what you've previously gone over to ensure that you are practicing and learning it still over time while you're getting ready for understanding the newer concepts. I think that's key. When those things all come together and we see that learning can stick over time. But if we only see that it happens 1 or 2 times in isolation, doesn't mean that they've learned anything. So it's about duration and then remembering.
Some leaders say they don't have time for coaching cycles. What's your response when you hear that?
I would say, what are your priorities? Are you an instructional leader? Or are you a manager? Or you're both?
Yeah, the bluntness on that is I think super important for people to understand. You have a duty if you're in if you're in a leadership role to give service to others and to help people grow. So a reflection and an assessment on yourself on that and why you're actually there is really important. What is one mistake leaders make when they are trying to scale coaching?
I think just and this happened to me is trying to go too fast,
Okay.
and especially if you're new and going too fast. You don't want to
So
take the chip too much.
so how did you learn to slow down?
I learned to slow down because of the feedback that I received. And
Ju-
I continue to receive feedback sometimes if I'm going too fast. And I think that's really important to have those communication channels in place because if you're not having that, um, then you won't know whether you're going too fast or too
Mhm.
slow.
Let's use that to segue from the changes to the implementing changes. And let's get into our final elemental segment, our fire element. And let's dive into spark or burn. All right, Dr. Rhodes. One rule: whatever you choose becomes the champion and must face a new challenger. 10 rounds and no explanation. Intuition or data?
Data,
Data or coaching?
coaching,
Coaching or systems?
systems,
Systems or innovation?
systems,
Systems or trust?
trust,
Trust or collaboration?
trust,
Trust or persistence?
Trust,
Trust or adaptability?
trust,
Trust or transparency?
trust,
And trust or capacity?
trust.
And your final champion is trust. Why is that the value you protect the most when leading large scale change?
Because I think it's foundational to everything that we do. Because trust is part of collaboration, transparency, systems, collaboration. Without trust and trust that others will follow through and support what we're doing, it ultimately will then fall apart. So that's why I think trust is really the value that I hold on to the most.
You helped build one of the first major single sign on infrastructures for an adult education consortium in California. That's a pretty significant system change. Who did you trust in the moments of doing this, and what made you decide that the risk was worth taking?
Well, when I went to our leadership council and talked to them about it over time and got their trust, that gave me the motivation and courage to do it. When you have other leaders that trust you and have listened to you, then you're ultimately going to have that efficacy to to move forward, and they got your back, and that's what it takes to, I think, have systems change.
What resistance did you face during that process?
Well, when people want to try one way and have done it for a long time, sometimes it's hard to change uh, old dogs to do new tricks.
You know, Dr. Matt, you said something earlier that stuck with me. Leaders need systems to scale impact. Teach us something here. What are the core components of a system that actually scales learning?
I like to look at it as I'm a big diagram person. So I like to look at like feedback loops. If you're able to create systems that have positive feedback loops that include professional development and coaching as part of that system that will give us that positive feedback of that change and ultimately positively impacting learning, then that's ultimately the systems that we want to develop are those that we can see not only in the abstract but in reality, but as a positive feedback loop to your goals or your school's goals to move us forward in whatever you're trying to do.
So, if a leader listening wanted to start building a system this year, what are the first three steps?
Yeah, the first one is to evaluate just current systems that you have. What's happening at your school? What makes it go? Secondly, is to share that with others, other leaders, teachers. Do they agree with you? Do those processes align with what you have uncovered? And then essentially you will then, with those people, invite them to come to the table with you in that part two to really analyze what you found. And then part three is taking those individuals with you to build or revise the systems that you have
Mhm.
because you can't do it alone. If you do it alone, then it's going to likely fail. You need to have people that have your back. You need to have people that have given you feedback and have had stakeholder input into cultivating what those are going to look like. And right now, for example, I'm leading an AI task force for my current organization. We have different stakeholders that we're going to be discussing, and we're taking our strategic plan and looking at, and over the course of the next really 4 big sessions of how are we going to be integrating AI into our classrooms, which we already have, but how are we going to move it into our operation and our systems in our operation? How are we going to use it to focus on some of the back end administrative tasks? And how are we going to do it with outreach in the community and also with local businesses and um, local community partners and getting their feedback? So that's just an example of what we're looking at in terms of our systems and how we're going to move forward with developing newer systems. We're developing a roadmap that goes with our strategic plan that we will then work on implementing over the next few years.
I can't wait to see how that works out for you, and I'm excited to follow up and have more conversations around that. Dr. Rhoads, our previous guest left this question not knowing that you were coming on the show and what we would be talking about. But the question left for you was, what's a fairly big decision you've had to make that required working across with multiple members of a network or ecosystem? And how did that go?
Yeah, it was initially before, it was years ago, but before we even got on that single sign-on work for our consortium, it was working with our member districts and their directors of technology to seeing kind of like what would they support us for? What would they not support us for? And what we learned is that they might support us on building what we call a federated system, but they wanted us to take the day-to-day operations of managing what we're going to do. So that gave us the information we needed to then move forward with. Um, it was a tough process because, you know, they're willing to support us in some aspects, but they also, you know, for better or the worse, gave us our own agency as well as what we thought maybe they could support us with. So it's a tug and pull type situation, which then
Mhm.
allowed us to then move forward. So sometimes it's going to be those situations where you're going to get some support, but you're not going to get it, or vice versa. And it's that ebb and flow, and you got to figure out your way to meander. Um, you know, it's not going to be a straight line, but it's going to be it's going to be a stream going downstream versus, you know, stopping the flow of water. If that makes sense.
It does, yeah. And what is a question you would like to leave for the next guest, not knowing who they are or when they'll be coming on the show?
What are your thoughts towards how schools are going to have to adjust to not only AI, but agentic AI? What's it going to be like with autonomous AI in the next future for running a school, as well as how do we prepare students for a future where we have autonomous AI?
Dr. Rhoads, it has been my pleasure to connect with you and have a great conversation around all of this. For those looking to connect further, make sure you check the description that has all of the links to everything that we've talked about today, along with how to connect with Dr. Matt Rhoads for future conversations if you would like to continue the process. And from me to you, Matt, thank you so much for taking time out of your evening again to join me.
Of course, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. This is a great format for this show, and it's really well done.
Thanks for sticking around to the end of the show. If you have feedback, a suggestion, or just want to start a conversation, fire off an email to tyler@elementaleducator.com. I actually read them. And if this episode sparks something, leave a review on Apple or Spotify. It helps more leaders find the show. And don't forget to subscribe on YouTube, where I put out additional content. I'll see you next time, same time, same place.